Good afternoon and welcome. If you frequent our GSA shows or just love Gilbert and Sullivan, you've no doubt heard terms such as Savoyard to describe a singer or fan of the Gilbert and Sullivan comic operas, or the Savoy operas to describe the G&S works themselves. But did you ever wonder where those words came from? You may not have realized that they actually refer to the majestic Savoy Theatre, which opened in London in 1881. Today we celebrate that grand old theater and give you a taste of what it was like to be there, the music you would have heard and the type of show you might have seen on the stage. So come back in time with us as we explore the history and heyday of the Savoy Theatre. The name Savoy came from the Savoy Palace, which was built in the 11th century on the location where the theater is now located, near the banks of the River Thames. The palace was the home of the House of Savoy, the ruling family of in the area of the time. After being burned down in the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, the location was repurposed as a hospital for the indigent in 1512, and it served in that role for almost 200 years. But the facility eventually suffered from poor management, reportedly being misused by loiterers, vagabonds, and strumpets. In the 18th century, the hospital was dissolved and the buildings were used for other purposes, including a military prison. In 1864, a fire burned everything except the stone walls and the Savoy Chapel, and the property sat empty until Richard D'Oyley Carte bought it in 1880. But let's back up a bit. Librettist William S. Gilbert and composer Arthur Sullivan first teamed up to write Thespis in 1871 and Trial by Jury in 1875. These works were originally meant to serve as one-time collaborations, but the producer, Richard D'Oyley Carte, recognized both the talent shown by these two men and even more, the potential of what they could create working together. His dream was to develop an English form of light opera that would displace the bawdy French shows that dominated the London stage at that time, and Gilbert and Sullivan appeared to have the magic that could achieve this goal. He convinced them to team up again for the full-length comic opera The Sorcerer in 1877. His faith was rewarded, and as they achieved huge international success over the next 4 years with the productions of HMS Pinafore, The Pirates of Penzance, and Patience. Carte also had a dream to open his own theater, which would showcase the Gilbert and Sullivan operas and other shows written by Englishmen. He hired an architect as early as 1877 and eventually purchased for £11,000 the Savoy Palace location as the site for his new theater in 1880. The design and building process were executed with speed and efficiency, although the advertised opening date still had to be pushed back several times due to the building's innovative electrical work. The Savoy Theatre officially opened on Monday, October 10th, 1881, and it was truly a wonder for its time. The exterior of the building was made from red brick and Portland stone. The interior decoration was in the manner of the Italian Renaissance, with white, pale yellow, and gold predominating, including gold satin curtains, red private boxes, and dark blue seats. It did not include any of the cherubs, deities, and mythical creatures common in the decor of rival theaters. Carte wanted nothing that would appear too garish or gaudy to his target middle-class audience. Seating capacity was 1,292, and the Times commented, "A perfect view of the stage can be had from every seat in the house." The Savoy was a state-of-the-art theater in every way and the first public building in the world to be lit entirely by electricity. As there was no public electric utility at the time, the Savoy had to be powered by its own 120 horsepower generator. As to why he had introduced the new electric light at his new theater, Carte said, "The greatest drawbacks to the enjoyment of theatrical performances are, undoubtedly, the foul air and heat which pervade all theaters. As everyone knows, each gas burner consumes as much oxygen as many people and causes great heat beside. The incandescent lamps consume no oxygen and cause no perceptible heat." The Times described the electric lighting as superior visually to gaslight and concluded that the theater is admirably adapted for its purpose. Its acoustic qualities are excellent, and all reasonable demands of comfort and taste are complied with. The Savoy also introduced several customer service innovations, including numbered seating, free programs, good quality whiskey at all the bars, and a policy of no tipping for cloakroom or other services. The land on which it was built is steep, stretching from the Strand down to the embankment along the River Thames, which is where the original entrance was located. After Cart built the Savoy Hotel in 1889, the theater entrance was moved up to its new location at the hotel's courtyard off the Strand. In addition to the sights and sounds, you can also imagine the smells of attending the Savoy Theatre, as Mr. Rimmel's scent factory was close by, as was Burgess's noted fish sauce shop. Opening night was a huge success, with Gilbert, Sullivan, and Cart taking curtain calls, along with the theater's architect. The show that was performed that night was Gilbert and Sullivan's Patience, which had been running for 6 months already at the smaller Opera Comique Theatre and was now moved to the Savoy. When the curtain opened, the full cast was on stage in costume to lead the singing of God Save the Queen. Cart then made a short announcement from the stage regarding the use of electric light, with gaslight being available as a backup in case the experiment failed. The gaslight in the theater was then lowered, and as the Daily Chronicle reported, as if by the wave of a fairy's wand, the theater immediately became filled with a soft, soothing light, clearer and more graceful than gas. A spontaneous cheer went up from the grateful audience, and Sullivan then raised his baton for the start of the overture. Here is a taste of what you would have heard at that first show at the Savoy Theatre.
When I first put this uniform on, I said as I looked in the glass, it's 1 to 1,000,000 that any civilian my figure and form will surpass. Gold lace has a charm for the fair, and I've plenty of that and to spare, while a lover's professions when uttered in Hessians are eloquent everywhere. A fact which I counted upon when I first put this uniform on. I said when I first put it on, it is plain to the veriest dance that every beauty will feel it a duty to yield to its glamour at once. They'll see that I'm freely gold-laced, in a uniform handsome and chaste, but the peripatetics of long-haired aesthetics are very much more to their taste, which I never counted upon when I first put this uniform on.
Patience ran for a total of 578 performances, surpassing HMS Pinafore as the longest-running Gilbert and Sullivan show at that time. With the successful opening of the Savoy Theatre behind him, Cart focused his attention on a plan for further development of his site. This plan would eventually culminate in the building of the adjacent Savoy Hotel. Cart also made plans to promote a lecture tour for Oscar Wilde in America. The tour had crossover publicity for Gilbert and Sullivan, as Wilde was seen as the center of the aesthetic movement parodied so hilariously in Patience. While electricity was used to light the house at the Savoy on day one, electric light was not used on the actual stage for another 2.5 months. At the first day of full theater electric lighting, the matinee performance of Patience on December 28, 1881, Cart demonstrated the safety of the new lighting by dramatically taking a hammer and breaking a lit bulb wrapped in a piece of cloth. To the relief of the audience, according to the Times, the flame was immediately extinguished without even singeing the muslin. The applause for this dramatic demonstration was so enthusiastic that Cart was called back to the stage for 2 curtain calls. In 1882, although the Savoy Theatre had proved to be a great success, Gilbert became very concerned about the excessive expenses. Cart insisted that Gilbert was needlessly challenging items that had previously been agreed to by the 3 partners, and was hurt that Gilbert waited to lodge his complaint until Cart was on his first vacation in 5 years, which he considered spoiled by Gilbert's complaints. This type of micromanaging oversight and constant paranoia about being cheated was a part of Gilbert's personality and was a harbinger of larger squabbles that would eventually have devastating consequences for their partnership. The first Gilbert and Sullivan show to actually premiere at the Savoy Theatre was Iolanthe on Saturday, November 25, 1882. Gilbert had pitched a rough sketch for Iolanthe to Sullivan just 9 days after the opening of the Savoy. Unlike Gilbert, who liked to have his work completed well in advance, Sullivan was notorious for composing right up to the last minute. But Iolanthe was a rare exception for him, and he had the time. He had the music composed early enough so that he had enough time to write an overture entirely himself for the first time. This resulted in an overture that was superior in construction and orchestration to anything he had done before. Sullivan conducted it with an orchestra of 29 pieces. The Era reported of the opening night, "The Savoy Theatre, lighted like no other theatre in Europe and looking exceptionally brilliant on this occasion, was crammed to its utmost capacity." The Times reported of the principal artists, Mr. Grossmith deserves to be mentioned first. His mock gravity as the Lord Chancellor was inspired by genuine humor. He gave excellent effect to the 3 amusing songs allotted to him. The Era said, "Miss Jessie Bond as Iolanthe may be credited with all the grace, delicacy, and fascination we should expect from a fairy mother, and her singing of the really exquisite melody in the last scene was one of the most successful items in the entire opera." Let's hear that exquisite melody, sung by Jessie Bond at the Savoy, "My Lord, a suppliant at your feet."
My Lord, a suppliant at your feet I kneel. Oh, listen to a mother's fond appeal. Hear me tonight, I come in urgent need. 'Tis for my son, young Strephon, that I plead. He loves, if in the bygone years thine eyes have ever shed tears, bitter unavailing tears for one untimely dead. If in the eventide of life such thoughts of her arise, then let the memory of thy wife plead for my boy. He dies. He dies, if only laid aside in some old cabinet. Memorials of thy long-dead bride lie dearly treasured yet. Then let her hallowed bridal dress, her little dainty gloves, her withered flowers, her faded dress, plead for my boy. He loves.
Imagine that you were a part of the Capacity opening night audience as we listen to "If You Go In" from Act 2 of Iolanthe.
If you go in, you're sure to win. Yours will be the charming maid. Be your love, the ancient song. Faint heart, never one fair lady. Never, never, never faint heart, never one fair lady. Every journey has an end, when at the worst affairs will mend. Dark the dawn when day is nigh, hustle
at such a price. He is not worth from mere evading. Be so kind to bear in mind, faint heart never won fair lady. Never, never, never faint heart never won fair lady. While the sun shines, make your hay. Where the will is, there's a way. Hear the lion in his lair. None but the brave deserve the fair.
I'll take art and make a start, though I fear the prospect's shady. Much I'd spend to gain my end. Faint heart never won fair lady. Never, never, never faint heart never won fair lady. Nothing venture, nothing win. Blood is thick, but water's thin. In for a penny, in for a pound. It's love that makes the world go round. Nothing venture, nothing win. Blood is thick, but water's thin. In for a penny, in for a pound. It's love that makes the world go round.
Iolanthe was a huge success, but it started with the devastating news for Sullivan, which in a strange twist it likely led to a longer string of collaborations with Gilbert. After he completed Patience, Sullivan had confided in Cart that he intended to write only one more show with Gilbert. Sullivan had seen the comic operas as a sideline to his desire for writing more serious music, albeit a very profitable sideline. On November 25, 1882, Iolanthe's opening day, Sullivan wrote in his diary that he received a letter from his investment manager just before starting for the theater. The advisor was bankrupt, and all of the money Sullivan had accumulated through his composing success was lost, about £7,000. This forced Sullivan to reconsider his plan and to realize that the only sure way of restoring his financial security was to continue his collaborations with Gilbert. In February 1883, he signed a 5-year contract along with Gilbert and Cart that outlined their continuing partnership and management of the Savoy Theatre. Gilbert never knew about Sullivan's original plan to end their collaboration after Iolanthe and his change of heart, so he went about his usual routine of creating the next show after the current show started its run. Now, Gilbert used one of his earlier plays as the basis for their next show, Princess Ida, which premiered on Saturday, January 5, 1884. The previous day, Sullivan was in poor health due to what he described as acute muscular rheumatism of the head and neck, and it seemed impossible for him to conduct the opening night. So Cart had new programs printed listing a guest conductor, but Sullivan was determined to conduct. At 7 o'clock, he had a strong injection of morphine and a cup of strong black coffee to keep him awake, crawled out of bed, and according to his diary, drove to the theater more dead than alive. But once in the orchestra pit, adrenaline and the reaction of the audience carried him through. Sullivan received praise for his music, with the Sunday Times reporting, "The score of the new opera at the Savoy may be summed up in a sentence. It is the best in every way that Sir Arthur Sullivan has produced, apart from his serious works." Humor is almost as strong a point with Sir Arthur Sullivan as with his clever collaborator, and when attained by such legitimate means, it is simply irresistible. At the end of Princess Ida's premiere, the creators were called out for their usual curtain calls. Sullivan took a bow with Gilbert and left the stage and immediately collapsed. From Act 2 of Princess Ida, here is "The World is But a Broken Toy."
Joy, unreal.
to say. The world we think has had its day. Its merriment is slow, alas. We've tried it and we know, alas. We've tried it and we know. Unreal, its loveliest hue, its pains alone are true.
After his collapse, Sullivan was bedridden for days with various ailments and exhaustion. When Carte went to visit him, Sullivan told him he had made up his mind not to write any more Savoy pieces. He later wrote, "I have resolved to devote myself now, if not entirely, at least in great measure, to more earnest work." However, he continued, "If I did yield to persuasion to write another, I should feel bound not to sever myself from my collaborator Gilbert." The matter came to a head in March 1884 when Carte wrote to Gilbert and Sullivan relating that Princess Ida showed signs of dropping, and as required by their contract, he was giving them 6 months' notice of a new opera being required. Sullivan's reply stated that he found it impossible to do another piece of the character of those already written with Gilbert, meaning that he didn't want to do another show with supernatural themes or improbable plot twists. Gilbert was hurt by this, and for the next 2 months they remained at an impasse. In May, Gilbert finally relented, writing to Sullivan, "Am I to understand that if I construct another plot in which there are no supernatural elements at all, you will undertake to set it?" Sullivan agreed, and Gilbert set out to find a theme for their next show. That summer was an extremely hot one in London, and audiences were sharply falling off for Princess Ida. It was agreed that they would shut down the Savoy for a month to avoid the heat. Then the theater reopened, with Princess Ida running for 4 more weeks, and then that was replaced by a revival bill of Trial by Jury and The Sorcerer. The new show that Gilbert wrote was The Mikado, which premiered on Saturday, March 14th, 1885. There were no supernatural elements in it, but the plot was arguably as improbable as any they had ever written. He set the story in far-off Japan, but the characters all clearly behaved like English men and women. Gilbert took great care to ensure that everything Japanese appeared genuine, including the costumes, set, and the use of fans. Gilbert was so nervous on opening night that he left the theater before the show began. But the night was a great success. One cast member wrote, "From the moment the curtain rose on the court swells in Japanese willow plate attitudes to its final fall is one long succession of uproarious laughter at the libretto and overwhelming applause for the music." The audience demanded several encores, including The Flowers That Bloom in the Spring and Three Little Maids, which were greeted with ecstatic applause. The Mikado became the most successful Gilbert and Sullivan opera with a run of 672 performances, a record for the Savoy Theatre that would stand for another 35 years. From the Mikado, let's listen to Nanki-Poo tell us his story in A Wandering Minstrel Eye.
A wandering minstrel eye, a thing of shreds and patches, of ballad songs and snatches, and dreamy lullaby. My catalogue is long through every passion ranging, and to your humours changing, I tune my supple song. I tune my supple song. Are you in sentimental mood? I'll sigh with you. Oh, sorrow. On maiden's coldness do you brood? I'll do so too. Oh, sorrow, sorrow. I'll charm your willing ears with songs of lovers' fears, while sympathetic tears my cheeks bedew. Oh, sorrow, sorrow. But if patriotic sentiment is wanted, aye, patriotic ballads cut and dried. For wherever our country's banner may be planted, all other local banners are defied. Oh, warriors and serried ranks assemble, never quail, or they conceal it if they do. And I shouldn't be surprised if nations tremble before the mighty troops, the troops of Titi-Poo. And if you call for a song of the sea, I'll heave the capstan round. With a yoke heave-ho, for the wind is free, her anchors a trip and her helms a lee. Hurrah for the homeward bound. To lay aloft in a howling breeze may tickle a landsman's taste, but the happiest hour a sailor sees is when he's down at an inland town with his Nancy on his knee. Yo-ho! And his arm around her waist. A wandering minstrel eye, a thing of shreds and patches, of ballad songs and snatches, and dreamy lullaby, and dreamy lullaby,
That summer, Sullivan sailed to America to take care of a family emergency, and Gilbert once again started to challenge Carte on administrative decisions. He ultimately acknowledged that their contract gave Carte control over everyday management of the Savoy, but ominously reminded him when the contract's term would end. Later that year, Gilbert threatened to leave the partnership over a curtain raiser show that Carte wanted to add before the Mikado, and he eventually relented on that as well. In 1886, Gilbert accused Sullivan of being late with writing the music for their next opera. The projected opening for the next show was repeatedly pushed back throughout the year, but pressure for a new offering was reduced by the continued success of the Mikado. Gilbert's next libretto, Ruddigore, was a parody of Victorian melodramas. Its plot was just as improbable as previous shows, and it contained a strong supernatural element, but this time Sullivan didn't seem to mind. On January 19, 1887, the Mikado finally ended its long run, and Ruddigore was set to open 3 days later on January 22nd. Following the great success of the Mikado, there was an elevated level of excitement and expectation for Ruddigore, but the audience response was decidedly mixed. The Times reported, the production of Gilbert and Sullivan's new operetta was on Saturday evening accompanied by a phenomenon never before experienced at the Savoy Theatre. With the rapturous applause of a more than sympathetic first-night audience, there was a small but very determined minority of mingled hisses. The Times had no hesitation in attributing them to the feebleness of the second act and the downright stupidity of its denouement. The set was also criticized. 2 of the blinds that opened to reveal the ancestors in the ghost scene failed to function properly on opening night, and one of them fell to the stage. At the Savoy Theatre, where appliances are perfect and where money is or should be no object, one expects something more realistic, sniffed the Times. Even reviews of the musical score were mixed. Gilbert and Sullivan took the criticism to heart and immediately set about making changes that were implemented before the next week's performances. Ruddigore was still a quality production, but it paid the price in comparison for following the most successful Gilbert and Sullivan opera. Here's the ghost of Sir Roderick Murgatroyd with one of the highlights of Ruddigore, When the Night Wind Howls.
When the night wind howls, in the chimney cowls, and the bird in the moonlight flies, and inky clouds like funeral shrouds sail over the midnight skies. When the footpads quail at the night bird's wail, and black dogs bay at the moon, then is the spectre's holiday, then is the ghost high noon, for then is the ghost high noon, high noon, then is the ghost high noon. As the summer breeze sweeps over the trees, and the mist lie low on the fen, from grey tombstones are gathered the bones that once were women and men. And away they go with a mop and a mow to the revel that ends too soon. For Cockerel limits a holiday, the dead of the night's high noon. The dead of the night's high noon. High noon. The dead of night's high noon. And then each ghost with his lady toast to the churchyard beds takes flight, with a kiss perhaps on her lantern chaps and a grisly grim good night, till the welcome knell of the midnight bell rings forth its jolliest tune, and ushers in our next high holiday, the dead of the night's high noon. The dead of the night's high noon. High noon. The dead of the night's high noon.
In September of 1887, Gilbert pitched to Sullivan a plot for their next show, which involved a magic lozenge that made people fall in love. Sullivan disliked it because of the supernatural element, and also because it seemed too similar to The Sorcerer. By November, Ruddigore had run its course and was replaced by a revival of HMS Pinafore. The Times described it as an old friend after a long separation. On Christmas Day, Gilbert visited Sullivan to pitch a new idea for a show based on the Tower of London, which he titled The Tower Warder. He said he got the idea when he glanced at an advertisement for the Tower Furnishing Company while waiting for a train. Sullivan was delighted, writing in his diary, immensely pleased with it. Pretty story, no topsy-turvydom, very human and funny also. And yet that show almost never happened, and the Gilbert and Sullivan collaboration almost ended at that point. In early 1888, Cart became very concerned about retaining their competitive edge with other theater companies, and he tried to commence a plan that he had been working on with Sullivan to produce a grand opera to be written by Sullivan in a new theater, disband the Savoy Company, and either lease out or sell the Savoy Theatre. Gilbert strongly objected to the plan, and it was put on hold. A revival of The Pirates of Penzance replaced HMS Pinafore in March amid much bickering between Gilbert and Cart regarding the theater and casting issues. The Mikado was next at the Savoy in June. The new opera finally premiered on October 3, 1888, with its working title having progressed from The Tower Warder to The Beefeater and finally to The Yeoman of the Guard. There was an unusually high level of acrimony between Gilbert and Sullivan in the final weeks of preparation before the opening, but the result was very well received. The Times reported that the author and composer had turned over a new leaf, and the Daily Telegraph felt that the music follows the book to a higher plane, and we have a genuine English opera, forerunner of many others, let us hope, and possibly significant of an advance toward a national lyric stage. The Yeoman of the Guard was a departure of sorts for the duo, with aspects of grand opera and little of the topsy-turvydom that had characterized their earlier works. Both Gilbert and Sullivan considered it to be the best of their operas. Picture yourself as an audience member processing this new GNS style on the opening night of The Yeoman of the Guard as we listen to "'Tis Done, I Am a Bride" from Act 1.
Would win
And now one of the most beautiful and most cherished songs ever composed by Gilbert and Sullivan, I Have a Song to Sing Of.
I have a song to sing of.
Sing me your song.
It is sung to the moon by a lovelorn loon who fled from the mocking throng. Oh, it's a song of a merry man moping mum, whose soul was sad and whose glance was glum, who sipped no sup and who craved no crumb, as he sighed for the love of a lady. Heyday, Heyday, misery me, lack-a-day. He sipped no sup and he craved no crumb, as he sighed for the love of a lady.
I have a song to sing. Oh.
What is your song?
It is sung with the ring of the songs made sing. Oh, love is love, life long. Oh, it's a song of the Mary Maid purely proud, who loved our Lord and who laughed aloud at the moan of the merry man moping mum, whose soul was sad and whose glance was glum, who sipped no sup and who craved no crumb, as he sighed for the love of a lady. Heyday, Heyday, misery me, lack-a-day-day. He sipped no sup and he craved no crumb, as he sighed for the love of a lady.
I have a song to sing of.
Sing me your song.
It is sung to the knell of a churchyard bell and a doleful dirge ding-dong. Oh, it's a song of a popinjay bravely born, who turned up his noble nose with scorn at the humble Mary Maid purely proud, who loved a lord and who laughed aloud at the moan of the merry man moping mum, whose soul was sad and whose glance was glum, who sipped no sup and who craved no crumb, as he sighed for the love of a lady. Heyday, Heyday, misery me, lack-a-day. He sipped no sup and he craved no crumb, as he sighed for the love of a lady.
I have a song to sing. Oh.
Sing me a song,
It is sung with a sigh and a tear in the eye, for it tells of a righted wrong. Oh, it's a song of a merry maid once so gay, who turned on a heel and tripped away from the peacock popinjay bravely born, who turned up his noble nose with scorn at the humble heart that he did not prize. So she begged on her knees with downcast eyes for the love of the merry man moping mum, whose soul was sad and whose glance was glum, who sipped no sup and who craved no crumb, as he sighed for the love of a lady. Heyday, Heyday, misery me, lack-a-day-day. His pains were o'er and he sighed no more, for he lived in the love of a lady. Heyday, Heyday, misery me, lack-a-day-day. His pains were o'er and he sighed no more, as he lived in the love of a lady.
Cart had not given up on his grand plans, which at this point included building a new theater and leasing the Savoy. By the end of 1888, the new Savoy Hotel was being constructed adjacent to the Savoy Theatre, and Cart's new theater was being constructed at a different site. Gilbert had plans of his own and was constructing a new theater of his own, the Garrick. At the start of 1889, Sullivan was most focused on his goal of writing his grand opera. He was open to using Gilbert as his librettist, but he wrote in his diary he made clear that the music must occupy a more important position than in our other pieces. Gilbert was very wary of how a collaboration so far outside their usual style would be received, and was reluctant to write something with Sullivan that was any more serious than the Yeoman of the Guard. As he wrote to Sullivan, "We have a name jointly for humorous work, tempered with occasional glimpses of earnest drama, and I think we should do unwisely if we left altogether the path which we have trodden together so long and so successfully." Regarding Cart's plan to leave the Savoy Theatre, Gilbert was against it, writing, "As to leaving the Savoy, I can only say that I should do so with profoundest reluctance and regret. I don't believe in Cart's new theatre. The site is not popular. Our names are known all over the world in connection with the Savoy, and I feel convinced that it would be madness to sever the connections with that theatre." Sullivan replied by saying he had hoped the Yeoman of the Guard was the beginning of works of a more serious and romantic character, and I have lost the liking for writing comic opera. But within a month, Sullivan was writing to Gilbert, offering to do just that, as long as certain stipulations were followed, mostly to give him more equal footing in staging and rehearsal decisions. So what changed in such a short time? Correspondence with Cart indicates that he told Sullivan that the new theater wouldn't be ready in time once Yeoman's run came to an end, and that if the Savoy were left vacant, it would seriously affect the income of both men. Cart also was concerned that if this happened, he wouldn't have enough financing to actually open the new theater, and Sullivan had been promised that the first production in that theater would be his new grand opera. It seems likely that Sullivan's finances once again drove him to continue his collaboration with Gilbert. The Gondoliers premiered on December 7, 1889, and was a great success, enjoying one of the longest runs of the G&S operas. The Sunday Times wrote, "From the time the curtain rose, there reigned at the Savoy Theatre one steady, undisturbed atmosphere of contentment. Contentment with the music, the dances, the piece, the scenery, the dresses, and not the least of all with the talented and loyal members of Mr. D'Oyly Cart's company." Critics also loved the big choreographed dance sequence, the Cachuca, with the Sunday Times calling it a treat to witness. "Nothing in its way is equal to this has ever been done at the Savoy. We predict that all London will want to see the Cachuca." Sullivan wrote, "Gilbert and I got a tremendous ovation. We never had such an enthusiastic house and such a brilliant first night." Little did they know at that time that they were never again to experience such success. From the Gondoliers, here's the very touching "There Was a Time."
There was a time forever gone. Oh, woe is me. It was no crime to love but thee alone. Oh, woe is me. One heart, one life, one soul, one aim, one goal. Each in the other's thrall, each all in all. Ah, woe is me. Ah, woe is me. Oh, buried at the grave close are the days that were, that never will be more.
And also from Act 1 of The Gondoliers, let's listen to the Grand Inquisitor sing his rousing I Stole the Prince.
I stole the prince and I brought him here and left him gaily prattling with a highly respectable gondolier who promised the royal babe to rear and teach him the trade of a time no near with his own beloved prattling. Both of the babes were strong and stout, and considering all things clever, of that there is no manner of doubt, no probable possible shadow of doubt, no possible doubt whatever.
No possible doubt whatever.
But owing I'm much disposed to fear to his terrible taste for tippling, that highly respectable gondolier could never declare with a mind sincere which of the two was his offspring dear and which the royal stripling. Which was which he could never make out despite his best endeavor. Of that there is no manner of doubt, no probable possible shadow of doubt, no possible doubt whatever.
No possible doubt whatever.
Time sped, and when at the end of a year I sought the infant cherished, that highly respectable gondolier was lying a corpse on his humble bier, I dropped a grand inquisitor's tear. That gondolier had perished. A taste for drink combined with gout had doubled him up forever. Of that there is no manner of doubt, no probable possible shadow of doubt, no possible doubt whatever.
No possible doubt whatever.
The children followed his old career, this statement can't be parried. Of a highly respectable gondolier, well, one of the two who will soon be here. But which of the two, it is not quite clear, is the royal prince you married. Search in and out and round about, and you'll discover never a tale so free from every doubt, all probable possible shadow of doubt, all possible doubt whatever.
A tale so free from every doubt,
all probable possible shadow of doubt, all possible doubt whatever.
In April 1890, a seemingly minor cost review led to what would become infamously known in the Gilbert and Sullivan world as the Carpet Quarrel, and it had a devastating effect on their partnership. Gilbert requested details of the Savoy Theatre expenses for the Gondoliers, which were shared jointly by Gilbert, Sullivan, and Carte, and estimated at £4,500. The response he received stated that the costs included some things for the front, new carpets, etc. Gilbert became upset and immediately went to see Carte in his office, little knowing that fateful meeting would prove to be their undoing. Gilbert claimed that he and Sullivan were liable only for repairs incidental to the performances, that carpets in the lobbies and on the staircases in front should not be considered as incidental to the performances. Carte disagreed, saying that as joint tenants, Gilbert and Sullivan shared responsibility for the upholstery in the front of the theater. Gilbert countered that if that were the case, then they should have been consulted on such a major expenditure. The conversation seems to have gotten very heated at that point, with both men becoming very angry. Gilbert then lashed out with comments he had also made on previous occasions, insulting Carte by stating that he had done very little to justify his place in their partnership. Over the ensuing weeks, the disagreements over the expenses seriously escalated, involving Sullivan as well as Gilbert and Carte. Gilbert insisted on a new management agreement immediately, and when Sullivan indicated he preferred to wait until the end of the run of the Gondoliers to address it, Gilbert stated that he could no longer continue in their collaboration. He contracted to write his next show with a new composer for production at a different theater and started legal proceedings against Carte. The London press began to report that the Gilbert and Sullivan partnership was over. The next 6 months brought further acrimony, which was likely the cause of major health issues for all three men. Sullivan's grand opera, Ivanhoe, finally opened at Carte's new theater, the Royal English Opera House, on January 31st, 1891, and it received mixed reviews. It ran for a disappointing 155 performances and was a financial failure. On June 20th, the Gondoliers came to the end of its very long run, and a non-GNS show ran in its place, the first time that had ever occurred at the Savoy. 2 years later, Gilbert and Sullivan put their differences aside long enough to write Utopia Limited, which premiered at the Savoy on October 7th, 1893. But the magic was gone. Tastes and styles in London musical theater had begun to change, and it saw only a modest success. They made one last attempt at collaboration 3 years later after that with the Grand Duke in 1896, but that resulted in a very disappointing run of only 123 performances, the shortest run of any Gilbert and Sullivan production. Over the next 3 decades, various comic operas by Sullivan, Gilbert, and other writers played at the Savoy Theatre, produced by Cart and later his widow Helen, and then other producers. The Mikado's record as the Savoy's longest-running production was finally broken by the comedy Paddy, the Next Best Thing, which played for 867 performances starting in April of 1920. In 1929, the theater was being managed by Cart's son, Rupert D'Oyly Cart, when it was closed for 4 months for a complete renovation, which included reducing the private boxes from the original 18 to only 1. When the theater opened with a new production of The Gondoliers, Lady Lucy Gilbert, William S. Gilbert's widow, sat in the single box. Through the rest of the 1900s, the Savoy hosted a mix of musical comedies and non-musical plays, as well as occasional seasons of Gilbert and Sullivan. When Rupert died in 1948, his daughter, Bridget D'Oyly Cart, took over the D'Oyly Cart Opera Company and was the director of the Savoy Hotel Group, which controlled the Savoy Theatre. The D'Oyly Cart Opera Company finally closed in 1982, and the passing of Dame Bridget in 1985 brought an end to the Cart family's long history with the Savoy Theatre. During a renovation in 1990, a devastating fire gutted the building. Now, if you're worried that our story ends with a wrecking ball and an Austin-style high-rise condominium tower built on the site, you can rest easy. The Savoy Theatre is still alive and well. Plans for a new modern building were overruled by English Heritage, the government agency tasked with the oversight of historic buildings, and the agency insisted on a restoration of the building according to the 1929 designs. The theater reopened in 1993 with a royal gala that included a specially commissioned ballet, Savoy Suite, set to a score based on Sullivan's music. Since then, the Savoy Theatre has been the home for many musicals and plays, as well as occasional pop concerts and operas, and even a World Chess Championship. You can currently catch Dolly Parton's 9 to 5, the musical, at the Savoy, with Stephen Sondheim's Sunday in the Park with George, starring Jake Gyllenhaal, slated for next June. We hope you've enjoyed our presentation on the Savoy Theatre. As you can tell, the story of the Savoy is fundamentally linked to the story of Gilbert and Sullivan. After a brief intermission, these talented Savoyards will bring you Mr. Jericho, a short one-act comic opera that was presented at the Savoy in 1893, just before the premiere of Gilbert and Sullivan's Utopia Limited. Although this funny little show is nearly a century and a quarter old, this will be its Texas premiere.